So I'm not interested in telling you how to start your story, but I was reading Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and chapter one I think gives us some pretty good ideas on how we might go about starting a novel. So a common piece of writing advice is make sure you get your story off to a good start. And that usually means like literally the first line should pull the reader in. And I definitely agree with that. I mean, you can look at numerous classic novels and they often start with a really compelling line. The novel Paradise begins with "They shoot the white girl first," or Camus' The Stranger, "Mother died today," or The Sound and the Fury, "Through the fence between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting." Now, those are all really strong beginnings, and they pull you in. You kind of want to keep reading from the get go. Now, Jane Eyre does not begin that way. So, I started the book and was amused that Charlotte Bronte, begins by talking about the weather. If I'm not mistaken, that is Elmer Leonard's first rule for writing. Never open your novel talking about the weather. So here we see Bronte kind of breaks that rule. Obviously, she's writing way before Leonard, and I should also add that this is a Victorian era novel, so things were different back then. Standards for telling stories were different. Stories often went on much longer than they do now. Writers often got paid by the word, and it was just a completely different ballgame. Anyway, the beginning of the novel is there was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning. But since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early. The cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. So that's not a great start, in my opinion. Basically, Jane doesn't get to go for a walk because the weather's really bad. Doesn't really pull you in. But what I want to suggest in this video, and this may be completely obvious to writers, but I don't know, I like talking about really obvious things sometimes, but when you start a novel and are looking to get off to a really good start, it doesn't just mean the first line or the first paragraph. It means the first scene or the first sequence or the first chapter. So when I say Jane Eyre gets off to a really good start, I mean the first chapter is really good. It's really compelling and it really draws you into the story. The very beginning, the intro, is about the weather and going for a walk. It's not so great. But if we look at the chapter as a whole, Bronte seems to have a really good sense of how to get the story rolling and how to keep you kind of into it and invested and want to keep going after chapter one. So let's take a look at what actually happens in the chapter. And if you want to actually read it first, I have a link below. You can actually read the book for free online with Project Gutenberg. They're a great service. They have a lot of classic texts available for no cost. So feel free to check that out first. But anyway, we're going to take a look at just a brief outline of chapter one and just see exactly what happens. All right, so as we already discussed, we start with bad weather, no walk today. And then as we move on, we see that Jane is okay with this. She doesn't like going for walks. Next, we've got Mrs. Reed. We're not quite sure who that is. And kids are hanging out by the sofa. Jane is excluded until she adopts a more sociable and childlike disposition. Now, I should actually throw in here, if you look at the text on the second point, Jane is okay with this. She dislikes walks. One of the reasons we learn she dislikes walks is because she hates to return from a walk, freezing cold and numb, and for some reason it reminds her when she returns of her inferiority to the other children in the house. So she's got this self-consciousness about her. Definitely want to point that out because that's very important to who Jane is as a character. All right, so moving on. So Jane is excluded until she adopts, as I said, a more sociable and childlike disposition. So we see Jane is not like the other kids. It's kind of odd. Why is she being excluded though? Like, who is Mrs. Reed, who are these kids, and how is Jane related to them. But already interesting things are happening. We're invested in Jane as a person and Jane's actions and what is happening to Jane and how she is being treated by others. And this is all just in the first couple paragraphs. And now we get into, the crucial actions of the chapter. Jane goes to read on a window seat. Here, if you look at the text, we also have a great little line. It is looking at the cold window panes, which are protecting but not separating me from the dreary November day. I thought that was a really kind of great line that Bronte came up with. And what it occurred to me was that's basically a metaphor for fiction and reading. It protects you, but it doesn't separate you from the world. It introduces you to dark ideas and strange ideas and really baffling ideas and concepts and situations that are completely outside of your own experience. And it keeps you safe because you're just reading a book, but it also exposes you to them. Now, here we get into another kind of odd little section because Bronte then dives into the book that Jane is reading. And that book is called Bewick's History of Birds. And then, Bronte just spends a good chunk of time just going into detail, describing Jane's experience reading the book and what she likes about it and why she finds it so powerful. But it's kind of lengthy and you're kind of wondering, all right, why is this going on so long? Why doesn't she just say she really likes the books and she really likes what the books have to say and she likes how the books make her feel? Why does she have to go into such detail? But I think the reason why is, one, it indicates that she does take refuge and find solace in reading books. And I think by going into such detail gives us a glimpse inside of Jane's mind and really accentuates just how meaningful books are to her. And so that makes it all the more jarring and upsetting when John intrudes. John is kind of a monster. He's 14 years old. He's the son of Mrs. Reed. And we learn he is constantly bullying Jane to the point where Jane is almost desensitized to it in a way. She expects it. She knows what's going to happen. Bronte has an almost kind of tongue-in-cheek, amusing description of John. She describes how he gorged himself habitually at table, which made him bilious and gave him dim and bleared eye and flabby cheeks. And you get a lot of that type of description in this chapter of John. She really goes to town with that. And you really are just repelled by this kid, and you definitely feel for Jane. You just get this horrifying scene where John is just basically abusing Jane emotionally and physically. It's very arresting and very disturbing, and also you get a great sense of craft on display here, because through this bullying scene where John is just taunting and being very cruel to Jane, he gives some information about her that was not given earlier. Now we're kind of getting a sense of who Jane is. We realize she's not a sibling of John or the other children. And John even says, "You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent," Mama says. "You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg." So now we're getting a sense through this very visceral and disturbing scene of bullying just who Jane is, that she had a father and left her nothing. So we're now figuring out Jane's an orphan and her life is very sad and brutal. So John is bullying Jane. He then takes her book and throws it at her. She then falls and cuts her forehead on the door. So things are getting really intense early on and she's bleeding. And then they start to wrestle basically on the floor. Finally, the fight is broken up by the servants and Mrs. Reed comes in and sends Jane to the Red Room. That's how the chapter ends, and we're like, okay, what is the Red Room? And that will end up being really important to the story. It's all very concise. The chapter is just about 5 pages long. She's given us a sense of who Jane is, what her problems are, what she likes, what she doesn't like, and just what her kind of day-to-day life is like, just in this really compact, visceral scene. So this chapter, in a way, acts as a microcosm of Jane's world and her identity, because we learn 3 really important things from the get-go. We learn, first, that Jane is very smart. We learn that she has this fiery personality. I mean, she fights back when she is attacked by John. And then we also learn that she is self-conscious about her looks. We see that in the opening sentences when she talks about not wanting to go for a walk. And those three things are going to be recurring throughout the novel. And by introducing them into chapter 1, we do get this miniature portrait of Jane's world, and we kind of get who she is right away, even though at the beginning she's only 10 years old. So if you're starting a story and you're really not sure what to include in that first chapter, it can help to look at other books and see what other writers do. And, I think Jane Eyre is a good example. Even though the book was written in the 1800s and we kind of have new rules for writing now than were common back then, it's still useful to look at, what someone like Bronte did and didn't do. And I think that can help us. That can kind of guide us and show us along the way. And chapter 1 of Jane Eyre is a really fantastic chapter in my mind. It really checks all the boxes for kind of what you want to do, even though, as I said, it kind of humorously begins in the worst possible way, according to Elmer Leonard. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. I'm hearing my neighbor outside making a lot of noise with some big machine, so I should probably cut this video off. But thanks so much for watching this. Please give the video a like. That really helps me out. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that already. And that's all I've got. So once again, thanks so much, and we will see you next time.